from Futures Without Violence, and we are hosting today's webinar titled Labor Trafficking and the Intersection with Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. Welcome and thank you for joining. This webinar is part of a project called Building Collaborative Responses to Trafficked Victims of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, supported by the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. We will also be hosting a second webinar on collaborating with community-based organizations and faith-based communities on May 24th. And we also host a 2.5-day training on building collaborations that will happen later this year. Today's webinar will run until 12:30 Pacific Standard Time. During the webinar, your phone line will be muted. You may ask a question or report a technical issue using the chat function on the right of your screen. I want to point out a couple of features that we will be using today. Closed captioning is provided in today's presentation. Captions will appear in the box on the bottom of your screen. You have the ability to scroll up and down in this box. Please note that when you manually scroll through the text, the auto scroll will be disabled. To re-enable this feature, please click on the auto scroll box located on the right corner of the captioning box. We'll do our best to answer all questions by the end of the presentation that show up in the chat box. So as a reminder, a PDF version of the PowerPoint slides is available on the bottom of your screen. As part of this project, we have an extraordinary team of faculty who have extensive experience developing programs for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault and collaborations to address human trafficking. Today we are honored to have one of the faculty members from our program, Maria Jose Fletcher. Maria Jose is a co-director and founder of Vida Legal Assistance, Inc., a nonprofit organization formed to advance the rights of immigrant survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking in persons, and other violent crimes. Ms. Fletcher regularly prepares and conducts educational presentations and trainings in the areas of immigration, domestic violence, and trafficking in persons in the United States and internationally. She is a co-chair of the Freedom Network Training Institute, a project of Freedom Network USA, created to provide training and technical assistance to multidisciplinary audiences on the subject of trafficking in persons. We also have with us today Perla Flores. Perla is the director of the Domestic Violence, Sexual Assault, and Human Trafficking Programs at Community Solutions, a nonprofit human services agency serving South Santa Clara County and San Benito County in California. Perla is a commissioner on the Santa Clara County Domestic Violence Council, and she chairs the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. So welcome to you both. A portion of the content of this presentation was developed by the Freedom Network Training Institute by Ms. Fletcher, who is a current member of the Freedom Network USA. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Maria Jose and Perla.
Good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, our learning objectives are that what we're going to try and we're going to hope to obtain is that as a result of this webinar, you will be better able to define labor trafficking and recognize the importance of multidisciplinary collaborations in assisting labor trafficking survivors, and at the same time recognizing the similarities and intersections between labor trafficking, sexual assault, and domestic violence, but with an overarching goal to maximize resources while we are providing a holistic, victim-centered assistance for those who come to our offices. And Perla?
Thank you, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I want to say that it's so appropriate that we provide this presentation in the context of domestic violence and sexual assault, because particularly in California, the domestic violence and sexual assault service providers provided the impetus for creating the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. And we did that because of several reasons. In the first place, we were seeing a lot of cases of intersection of domestic violence and sexual assault. And we also realized that while there's a lot of legal nuances that are specific to every type of abuse, there are similarities in terms of the power and control dynamics that are used in domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking cases. And we also realized that as in domestic violence and sexual assault cases, a lot of the human trafficking survivors know their perpetrators, and so there's additional dynamics that come up in that context. And we also realized, lastly, that as domestic violence sexual assault providers, we were able to extend the services already offered to domestic violence and sexual assault survivors to human trafficking survivors in terms of providing victim-centered, empowerment-based, and trauma-informed crisis intervention and long-term supportive services. So similar to domestic violence and sexual assault, survivors of human trafficking face barriers that are, again, very similar when they're trying to leave an abusive situation and reintegrate with their community, particularly because, again, as I mentioned, many human trafficking survivors know the perpetrators, and in many cases, like in domestic violence cases, depend and rely on their perpetrators. So there's similar needs in terms of basic services and safety planning. Shelter or housing is going to be a huge need that we'll talk about a little bit more in depth. There's also concerns around safety, having access to restraining orders, et cetera. And survivors may experience financial abuse, particularly if they relied on their traffickers or exploiters for housing, for income, and they need to be able to receive the support necessary to create that economic independence. So one of the importance of collaboration, particularly in cases of domestic violence, sexual assault, where there is that intersection with human trafficking and labor trafficking in particular, is that no one organization or individual can provide for all of the different needs that a survivor are going to come up for survivors. And so when we started doing this work, we modeled the support and the services after the State Department's 4 Ps of human trafficking, which include prevention of trafficking, protect victims, prosecution of perpetrators through a partnership or collaborative approach. And Maria Jose is going to speak a little bit more about the 4 Ps in a little bit. But I also want to say that it's so important with this particular issue of labor trafficking to engage not just domestic violence and sexual assault advocates, but to really partner with law enforcement, to partner with human trafficking task forces. Immigration attorneys are so important, and other service providers, both faith-based and culturally specific service providers, and ensure that these different providers and law enforcement understand the nuances of labor trafficking and are able to work in partnership and collaboration to provide a full spectrum of comprehensive support for survivors. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Moni to go into our poll.
So we have a quick poll. Please answer so we can get a better sense of who is out there today.
So we see here domestic violence survivors advocates. We have a good percentage. And at the same time, others that we don't know, maybe health, maybe education. That would be wonderful. So we got everyone to answer. Should we move to the next poll? Just a few law enforcement officers I see. Okay. I see, Moni, you're trying to change to the next poll. We have another poll coming up. Okay, wonderful. So this is to give us some idea of, for us to get some idea of whether you have received training on human trafficking, specifically on labor trafficking, and these issues that we're going to cover today. So we have many of you have received basic training, and some, a significant number, intermediate. So sounds great. Welcome, everyone. Okay. 48% basic. Okay, wonderful. So as, and this is Maria Jose again, and as I'm going to move along here. As Brenda mentioned, and it was a great segue, we're going to be talking first about what is labor trafficking and then move on into the connections with domestic violence and sexual violence. So Brenda mentioned the VTPA and the initially three-prong approach, which now has turned into the four-piece approach. Before the VTPA in 2000, we were working with survivors of trafficking, utilizing the United States anti-slavery legislation available, and anything that we can find that could provide assistance to someone surviving labor exploitation slavery. We were not using the terminology trafficking at the time. And so that experience as service providers in conjunction with our Department of Justice at the federal level, Department of Labor at the federal level, and EOC gave us the need and the push for developing and presenting proposals for legislation that could cover what we thought they were the main gaps. And that experience of working together informally, the possibility to turn it in a formal approach. And so the connection between the prosecution of these crimes and the creation of new crimes, even though the activity, the crime existed, but the laws that could fight them did not specifically address how this crime manifested in the 21st century or the 20th century, then forced us to look at that connection between the prosecution, investigation of the crime, and the protection of the victims. And even though we listed as first prosecution and then protection and prevention, all of these actions are intertwined. We looked at the actions in prevention, and we have moved beyond just the State Department collecting information from other countries, even collecting information for what is happening in the United States at this moment, to really moving to the fourth P, which is the partnerships. Governmental, non-governmental agencies working together in the prevention and the protection, utilizing also the public sector at all levels, federal, state, and local. So this is very important because it reflects the experience that we have with the cases back in the late 1990s, and the hope is that by implementing, and when I say us, it's because we were working with survivors at that time, and they were the ones that came and told us, this isn't working, this is not working. So I'll give you an example of a case that we worked in the early days, 1997, 1998 in Florida, a young woman that was escaping serious abuses and labor exploitation by the employers. She was a domestic worker, a nanny. She escaped the situation with the help of a boyfriend, someone that contacted her at a bus stop, and because she expressed what she was experiencing at the house, said, I'm going to help you get out of there. Well, later on, that boyfriend, Good Samaritan, new love, became abusive and utilized what she had experienced in the employment situation to continue controlling her. That person sought assistance of a domestic violence shelter as a victim of domestic violence, and later on an advocate identified her as someone that had been abused in the context of her employment. So you see how that person starts looking for assistance, the advocate looking at what the domestic violence community can do for her, and then looking into us as immigration attorneys, how can we help her? So that's one of the easiest ways to see how both areas of law come together to assist someone, and not only the legislation available at the time, but also the services that were available only for victims of domestic violence that now needed to adapt what they were doing to help her with her other victimization. So and this is just a summary, many of you already have received training on what is trafficking. So in general, we divide it in 3 categories to facilitate the conversation. So for all of you that are working with all forms of trafficking like we are, you're going to encounter individuals that are under 18 and they are induced to engage in commercial sex acts. There is no requirement under the federal law and in many of the state laws to demonstrate that that person has been either forced or defrauded or coerced into engaging in that commercial sex act. And when I say commercial sex act, I'm talking about a sex act where there is an exchange for something of value. Then you have those individuals that are engaging or also induced in commercial sex acts, but that are over 18, and there has to be a component of force, fraud, or coercion. Those individuals that are adults and they are engaging in this act, and there's someone else that is benefiting for that work or service that they're providing. And then we have everyone else under 18 or over 18 that are forced to perform a service of labor in conditions of involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, slavery, through force, fraud, or coercion. And when we mention involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, these are specific, there are specific definitions under the U.S. Penal Code that mainly the prosecutor or the investigator is going to concentrate to determine what type of evidence they have to prosecute someone that engages in this act. So from the perspective of us as service providers and from the perspective of the victim, those fine lines should not deter us from presenting that array of services that we're going to talk about later on during this presentation. And I'll give you more details when we get to the differentiating these crimes. Trying to change. So again, you have the U.S. Code definition of labor trafficking, where we are talking about the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, and when we're talking about this, we would like to highlight and underscore the word "or." This is about an enterprise or individuals engaging in these actions. These are the traffickers that are either recruiting, harboring, or transporting, or providing, or obtaining a person with the knowledge, and remember that with the knowledge that the person will end up in a situation of slavery, of trafficking, of debt bondage, or forced, in any other way, forced labor, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So you could see someone and it could be someone in the United States, it could be someone in the same community where the victim resides, and that person says, I have a job for you, you can come and clean these rooms that I have in my motel, I will pay you $8 an hour, you can work 40 hours a week. So that person is recruiting, brings the person to the hotel or the motel, and then the circumstances change. So they could be, you could see a situation where the person was defrauded because now that person is no longer able to leave the place, is working more than 40 hours. If the person complains, then the employer says, I am going to report you to law enforcement because you're a drug user or because you are an undocumented person from another country. So it could be any of these threats. It could be actual use of force, or the threat of force, or the manipulation of the legal system too. So this is another definition that clarifies what labor trafficking is, and the person is going to be performing service or labor in any industry. When we talk about minor victims of labor trafficking, I think it's important to see, because we notice the difference between sex trafficking and labor trafficking for minors, where if the person is engaged in commercial sex act, there's no requirement by the law to show that that person was coerced or defrauded or forced, like pretty similar to statutory rape. But when we're talking about a child working in the fields in Central Florida or in California or anywhere in the United States, or maybe that child under 18 is working in a restaurant or in a sweatshop, we as perhaps as prosecutors or investigators, we have to show that that person was coerced, defrauded, or forced. But as a practitioner in immigration law, our experience as practitioners has been that because of the condition of the child as a child and the inability of that child to engage in contracts and knowingly engage in any type of agreement with the employer, or also unable to discern when they're being defrauded, it's pretty easy to provide the evidence that these kids, these individuals, these young adolescents have been either coerced or defrauded or forced. But keep in mind that there is a difference there for purposes of the definition. Okay? And I'm going to turn to Perla now so we can put into an exercise what we are discussing now, all of these definitions.
Yes, thank you. This is Perla again. So for many of the domestic violence advocates on the call, this scenario is going to seem very familiar. Aisha is a 28-year-old woman from India. She holds a master's degree in engineering. And several months ago, Aisha moved to the U.S. with her new husband, Robert. Prior to marrying Aisha and bringing her to the U.S., Robert assured her that she could pursue her career goals in the U.S. She can go to school, she could work, whatever she wanted to do. However, shortly after arriving in the U.S., Aisha discovered that Robert had a fiancée and that he only brought Aisha to the U.S. to serve as a cook, a maid, and a nanny for Robert's younger brother and for his parents. For several months, Robert and his family emotionally and physically abused Aisha. She'd begin her day at 6 o'clock in the morning, cooking and cleaning for the family, and often didn't end her day until midnight. She had no means to return to her home country, and she was also constantly under surveillance from Robert or his family. And to add a little bit to the scenario here, because this is actually an actual case that Community Solutions worked on, when Aisha was allowed to call her home once a week with her parents, with Robert and his parents in the same room, and she was instructed in terms of what she had to say, that everything was great, everything was working wonderfully. And Robert also hacked into or took over Aisha's password and would email Aisha's family pretending to be Aisha, saying, "I'm so happy, everything is great here." So in this particular scenario, I mean, we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. And the first question is Aisha a victim of domestic violence or intimate partner violence? And again, for the domestic violence advocates on the call, it's very simple. Domestic violence, the way that we define it, is one individual using different tactics to exert and then maintain power and control over his or her partner in the context of an intimate relationship. So that definitely fits in here in terms of domestic violence. And so the primary victimization would be domestic violence. And Maria, if you can give the caveat in terms of OVW grants.
Yeah. So for all of you that are receiving funding from the Office of Violence Against Women, and some of you may not know exactly where your funding comes, so please talk to your supervisors and find out. Any of you, there has to be a connection when you're talking about someone that perhaps is a victim of human trafficking. And right now we're making the analysis first. We're trying to identify whether this person is a victim of domestic violence first or sexual violence first, because your funding determines that and dictates that you need to make that connection. So if later on you find out that Aisha is a victim of human trafficking, your center, your domestic violence center or sexual assault center, if it receives funding from OVW, will be able to help her if she's a victim of human trafficking too.
Thank you. So next we determine if Aisha is a victim of labor trafficking as well. So if we go back to the definition that Maria Jose provided, there were certain promises that were made to Aisha. She was promised that certain living conditions. She was promised that she would be able to pursue her academic and career goals, and basically entered into a marriage and relocated from India to the U.S. Because of those promises and that belief. So the recruitment, because basically the marriage was a recruitment, was based on fraud. She was promised certain things that did not materialize. And then she was forced to perform labor as soon as she arrived. She was not compensated for that labor. And also she was physically and emotionally abused, not only by her husband, but also by several of his family members. So I gave you guys all the answers already. But I also wanted to spend some time to talk a little bit about keeping in mind that federal and state laws may differ. And while a human trafficking victim doesn't necessarily need to be certified as a human trafficking victim in order to receive victim services, there may be a difference in terms of the legal remedies that individual, legal remedies and benefits that that individual is able to connect to. So Maria Jose, if you can speak a little bit to that.
Exactly. Well, I'm gonna talk a little bit more when we talk later on the on exactly how to access those services, perhaps. And maybe I can now move on into the next slide that talks about who could be a victim, and then from there we can move on into how do we access those reliefs or benefits at the time. Hold on, let me move to who's moving it. Oh, okay. Oh, I think we're skipping did we skip one slide, Moni? Oh, there we are. Okay, wonderful, thank you. So as Perla was mentioning, in this case, Aisha is clearly a survivor of both, or a victim at this point, of domestic violence and labor trafficking. The cases are not going to be as clean cut or easy to identify as this case. And why is this? People that are going to come to your doors, perhaps, are going to be from all sorts of strata in society, different countries. Anyone that is seeking employment or in the position of a need to find employment and support their family could end up being a survivor of labor trafficking. So could be a citizen, a non-citizen, non-citizens with legal status or without legal status. Many of you already are familiar with individuals from other countries that are here with student visas, with temporary visas, people that are here like Aisha, that probably she legally married Robert, and Robert petitioned for her. Perhaps she's already a resident. Perhaps she's a conditional resident. So you see that anyone that could be here with legal status also could be at risk of being victim of labor trafficking. You also could encounter United States citizens from different backgrounds, and this is not anymore an issue of language or nationality. We look at other forms of vulnerability that make someone the target of the traffickers. It doesn't, the trafficker is not gonna look into discriminated to race, class, gender, schooling, religion, or culture. They're really approaching individuals that are feeling or are experiencing situations that put them in a situation of vulnerability. So it could be men, women, children, the elderly, any of them that are from the LGBT community, the lesbian, gay, bi, and transgender communities, the disabled, all ages. Unfortunately, the traffickers don't always fit into clear boxes, so that's why it's important that we have this conversation. And going back to the funding, we have funding that takes us in the direction of only providing services to groups of people. Some of our human trafficking programs right now only receive funding for trafficking, and perhaps they feel that they can only help someone that qualifies for a T visa. So it depends on how that program is structured. The same with the programs that see individuals that are victims of sexual violence or domestic violence. Some of the programs are dual purpose, others are not. So again, we have to look at the individual, see what that person has experienced, and that's why I want to move into the next slide to show you another way to identify whether that person is survivor of labor trafficking. So again, we look at the ORs in the recruitment, the harboring, the transportation, but not all of these elements need to be present. In Aisha's case, you saw that she was recruited by Robert, and then he obtains her through the marriage, probably provided for the transportation to come to the United States, and then she's harbored at that home state where she's ultimately going to be exploited. How is he doing that, and how the family is also participating in that endeavor is through the threat of the force, and sometimes the use of the force, the fraud, by deceiving Aisha on what were the circumstances of her traveling to the United States, and the coercion, which is that psychological coercion, and it could be also the physical coercion. I'm going to talk more about coercion in a second. But then again, look at the purposes. So in that case, it's someone that she's deceived, she thinks she's going to be, and we don't talk much, and probably Perla knows more of the details of the case on how is this an arranged marriage? Is this a marriage of like he enamored her and tried to convince her that he loved her? But these situations occur in many of these servile marriages that we encounter, where it's either I really love you and nobody else is going to love you like I do, similar to a case of eventually domestic violence, but utilizing those tools to keep that person in a slavery-like condition or actually enslaved. So this is a good chart for you to use when you're trying to identify if the person that you're helping is a victim of labor trafficking or not. And then there's certain questions that you want to ask, and very important questions. In this case, perhaps we're looking at during the process, which is the recruitment or the harboring or the obtaining, whether, how that process of recruitment occur, how the person migrated or how the person left the home. And it could be someone from the United States being recruited in Kansas to come work in Florida or even in their home state. Was it a safe environment before? What happened during that time? How did they find out about the job? Was in the newspapers, was on the internet, was by a word of mouth. So those questions, open-ended questions, would lead you into then later on what happened. And you want to ask these questions open-ended. You want them to tell you the story and allow them to tell you the story, the same thing that you're doing when you're interviewing a survivor of domestic violence. And so they are going to tell you what happened when they arrive, and now you're going to look at the means. Were they defrauded? What was told at the beginning, and then what happened when then they actually began working at the job site? Were they afraid? What was that environment that the trafficking normally, in general, by the cases that we work on, we realize that what they do, they create this environment of fear, either through the actual use of force or through the threat of force, or through the coercion. And then at the end, what happened? Did this person work? And so that is a very important question. What did you do? What were you asked to do? Were you paid? Does that matter whether the person got paid or not? But it's an important question. Does it matter for purposes of trafficking? Not if the person could not leave and then the person was forced, even if they were paid something. How much, how often, what access they had to that funding. Some of my clients, when we start talking, they say, well, the lady of the house, a domestic worker, she was paying me. And I said, well, did you get access? Did you have access to that money? What happened to the money? What did you do? Oh, no, she was keeping it safe for me to, she will give it to me when the contract will end. So for 2 years, this individual never saw a dime from that salary that was promised. So the next question is, what happened when you asked for the money? So perhaps the employer is going to say, here it is. Or perhaps the person is going to say, no, when you finish, I'm going to give it to you. Well, but I need some because I need to send it to my son in whatever the son is. And she says, no, I keep it until you finish the contract. So you have to ask those questions to see where is that going. What happens if the person tries to leave? What happens if the person asks for their passport, for their documents? And that the answer will lead to the conclusion whether this person is a victim of labor trafficking or not. So these are guidance, these are questions to help you get to that. They're open-ended. They're not we're not giving them to you with the intention of giving you a checklist, but they could help you create certain forms for your intake or for your subsequent meetings with survivors to help you identify that person as a victim of labor trafficking. So then, I promised that I was going to talk a little bit more about coercion, and this is very important. We had anti-slavery laws in the United States before the TVPA in 2000, and those laws addressed slavery where there was use of force or the threat of force, the actual use of force or the threat of force. This concept of the coercion was missing. This is how slavery and trafficking manifests now. The traffickers are very, the nuances of how they exert power and control over the workers are very sophisticated. And I use the terminology power and control because it's another, again, it's another similarity with domestic violence. The power and control shows in perhaps today you produce 10 pairs of shoes, and I am very happy as the employer, and I am going to reward you. But tomorrow, you cannot produce the 10 pairs, and I'm going to punish you, and I'm going to punish you severely. Or perhaps I'm not even going to punish you, but I'm going to punish someone else in the crew. So workers see one person in the workforce that is being abused or threatened with being abused. And sometimes, in some cases that we work, they don't even get to see that person being hurt, but they hear. Someone else tells them, if you try to escape, if you don't work the manner and the way that they're asking you, if you don't work the 14 hours, the 16 hours, the 17 hours, then there's going to be punishment. So that is how the coercion is physical and psychological coercion, and it's subjective. It's from the perspective of the survivor, the victim. It's not the prosecutor making the assumption or the assessment that that person was coerced, because in his or her shoes, that's how they will feel. So this is subjective. It's from the perspective of the victim and the victim's history. What has happened to that person before? Why this threat makes sense to that person and they fear escaping or complaining or trying to receive some kind of answer from the employer, versus the other person that has not experienced perhaps sexual abuse when they were younger or domestic violence in the home. So that makes a big difference. The history of the individual makes a big difference when we're making that assessment of whether this person has been coerced or not. So that keep that in mind. And now we are going to talk a little bit about the differences between wage theft, labor exploitation, and forced labor, because we hear that a lot. I got this call, the person described what happened, and we see that it didn't arise to trafficking. So what do we do now? And so remember what I said at the beginning, we are trying to look at the intersection of domestic violence and sexual violence and labor trafficking. With what purpose? Because if our funding is just for domestic violence and sexual violence, and that person is coming to us that also has been exploited in the employment arena, are there any other provisions under law that could help her in addition to what we can do for her as a victim of domestic violence or a victim of sexual violence? But also, if that person is not actually a victim of human trafficking, but they have been victims of labor exploitation and wage theft, can we do something? So I'd like to look first at wage theft. And in my mind, I create a line, a continuum, where we can see wage theft, labor exploitation, human trafficking as occurring, and sometimes even in the same workforce. All of them are occurring. And what we say is that if wage theft is occurring, if labor exploitation is occurring, chances are that trafficking is also occurring. Maybe not to all the employees, not all the workers, but some of them. So wage theft is earning less than the minimum wage under federal or state, not getting paid overtime required by law, not allowed to take meal breaks, facing employer retaliation if one complains about unfair conditions. And if we look at that, we can say, well, a victim of trafficking may experience all of them. But the big but is the person can walk away and seek assistance, meaning the person goes to the employer and says, I'm very unhappy. You're not paying me what you are required by the law. I just found out they told me that I was supposed to make $15 an hour. You are not paying me that. And the boss says, the employer says, if you don't like it, leave. And so in those cases, there is relief. And we look at our federal and state laws. We can call the Labor Department. We can call an attorney that is an expert on wage theft, labor and employment conditions, and legislation. And that person can advise on what that individual that has been that has suffered wage theft can access. In that sense, moving on to labor exploitation, we see now that everything that we see under wage theft could occur, in addition to substandard or exploiting working condition, perhaps no working compensation if the person is injured, sent home to rest and told not to tell anyone that they got injured, deductions that are illegal in the agricultural cases that we work regularly in Florida. We see that the workers live on site. They live in the camp, men, women, children, and then perhaps the field manager or sometimes even the grower or the field owner will run that housing development and charge them the rent, a rent that it is unreasonable and unconscionable, that if the individuals would like to, perhaps they get hurt and they would like to go to the hospital or go to a doctor, they have their own connections with certain doctors, and the charges are also inflated. If they need to purchase clothing or other items, they are the ones selling them to them, and all of that is being deducted from their checks. Sometimes, and many times, there is sexual harassment or other violence and physical and verbal violence. And sometimes they're exposed to discrimination based on age, gender, sexual orientation. But again, we look at the bad. And to me, it's very, very difficult also to see that gray line, that very fine line on is this trafficking or is labor exploitation. Mainly it is, can the person leave the premise, leave the employer, leave that place of work and seek assistance. And again, it's about being able, and in many cases when it's clear is when the employer says, I don't care, this is the way I run my business, and you can go find a job somewhere else. But in many cases, that labor exploitation turns into forced labor. And now is, and remember when I mentioned to you the subjectivity of this analysis, and I can, you're probably thinking right now, but if the person doesn't have the documentation, if the person doesn't have the money to go home, if the person can't even call a family member to come get them, if they are perhaps in a home, domestic worker in an isolated area, rural, is that trafficking, is that labor exploitation? And perhaps it's both, But if the employer is not threatening with harming the person, with reporting the person perhaps to immigration, with many times, sometimes in the cases where women have been sexually abused within the context of the work, sexual harassment, they're threatened with reporting what has happened and telling their family members that they have engaged in sex while with the manager. So those threats really make it impossible for the individual to leave that employment, or they having fallen into such a huge debt. They have incurred this huge debt, and the trafficker says, now you owe me the interest on what you borrow from me, the recruitment fee, perhaps the training. During the time that they were trained, they were paid certain, and said, well, you're going to be deducted while you are working. All of that could be present, and now the person cannot walk away without serious harm to them or to a family member. Many of the traffickers are keeping control of the victims' children or other family members. Some of you may know already of a case that happened in Iowa where women and children were working in factory, not a factory, but a packing company. And there, I think it was chicken and an egg packing. There were two cases in Iowa. And during this time, the women and the children were recruited from one specific area in Central America, and they were brought to the factory, and they were there. And when they tried to leave, and the conditions were horrific, and they were exploited. And when they tried to leave, they were isolated in that area of Iowa. They couldn't reach any other place. They didn't have the funding to go anywhere, and they were also sexually harassed or sexually molested by the employers. So that case was a trafficking case. Many of the individuals working there were victims of trafficking. So you see how you have this continuum, and I think perhaps before we go to the scale, this scale helps us evaluate what we have in our office, in our case, if we are an investigator, if we are a prosecutor, or if we are a service provider. What has this person experienced, and what are the other components that moved from perhaps just fair wages, safe conditions, unsafe, well, moving from safe wages into issues of safety and wage issues, to exploitation, and then forced labor. So you see how the conditions start deteriorating and the individual cannot leave the situation. And if that person also is a victim of domestic violence and sexual violence, the compoundment of the victimization either prevents that person from seeking assistance as a victim of domestic violence or also prevents the person from seeking assistance as a victim of human trafficking. So in the case of Aisha, just to bring you back to her story, we see that Aisha was not getting paid for the work that she was doing at the home. She was taking care of family members, she was cooking, she was cleaning, she was taking care of children, and not only not getting paid, also she suffered the abuses, the physical abuse, the psychological abuse, and was defrauded and coerced into that situation. So Aisha never experienced fair wages or safe conditions. And I'm going to, Perla, I'm going to move the slide to you. I'm going to give
Thank you. Thank you, Maria Jose. And for the domestic violence sexual assault service providers on the phone, I think that we all know how important multidisciplinary collaborations are. And if we think about in the context of domestic violence and sexual assault, for community solutions particularly, we are required as part of our deliverables for grants to participate in multidisciplinary collaborations. And the purpose for that is really to increase the support offered that can be offered to survivors, as well as to increase the number of doors that domestic violence or sexual assault survivor can enter and access services through. So that it's equally important to develop those relationships in different sectors and train different partners to increase the number of organizations and individuals that are capable in terms of identifying potential human trafficking survivors. And so some of the common sectors where labor trafficking may be found, agriculture is huge. And it's really interesting because even though there's a large agricultural community, particularly in California, we know that there are cases of human trafficking, of labor trafficking that are happening in this community because we've actually have, here in San Benito County, there's a large Triqui population that resides in San Benito, Triqui from Oaxaca, so a lot of them don't speak Spanish, they speak the Triqui language, and we have been connected to human trafficking survivors through word of mouth. So even though to this date, and hopefully this will change soon, at least in California, there has not been a prosecution for labor trafficking within the agricultural community. We know that it exists because those survivors are being connected to us through other survivors and word of mouth. We've also seen multiple cases of labor trafficking in domestic work. Aisha is a good example of that. We've worked with one woman from Ethiopia who was asked by her brother. This woman's husband passed away in Ethiopia, and the brother said, come to the U.S., come to California. You can live with us. We're going to take care of you. We're going to take care of your baby can be born here. Once she arrived, they basically enslaved her and forced she became the nanny and the maid to her brother and his family. We have seen multiple cases. We see a lot of cases of exploitation in terms of domestic work within the Filipino community. And then we've also seen a lot of cases of labor trafficking within the hospitality community, particularly in restaurants. I've had multiple cases. We've seen cases of labor trafficking with cosmetologists, and actually there was a significant case here in California a few months ago that involved hairstylists from Spain being recruited to come to the U.S. and work as cosmetologists, and they're actually, once they arrived, it was a different situation in terms of the pay and the working conditions and the living conditions. We've also seen labor trafficking cases with street vendors. There was actually a pretty large case here in California a few years ago involving fruit vendors that were being brought here specifically from Puebla. And again, as I mentioned earlier, most of the times the victims know their traffickers and know their exploiters, so there's that level of trust. So these individuals were being brought here from Puebla. were being exploited in terms of selling fruit all across California, into Oregon, into Washington. The individuals were working up to 12, 13 hours a day. And at the end of the day, they were dropped off at a corner. So you have to sell these boxes of fruit. At the end of their shift, if they didn't finish selling that fruit, then they had to go and sell it door to door until they were finished with that fruit. There was about 20 individuals living in one house, sleeping on cots on the floor without even any blankets or any sheets. We also had a case of labor trafficking with ice cream vendors. There are ice cream vendors that were targeted. These traffickers specifically targeted individuals from Tijuana. That they reached out to them through Facebook. That if you have a visa, a tourist visa, you can come to the U.S. and work selling ice cream. We'll pay you cash so that you don't have to report that, because obviously that they wouldn't be able to work with a tourist visa, and then you can go make some money and go back home. Well, when they arrived here, the situation was completely different. They ended the ice cream vendors basically ended up making like $2 an hour, working again 12 to 14-hour shifts, being threatened and being coerced and abused. So these are just, and there's definitely other sectors where labor trafficking can happen. It can basically happen within any sector, so it's important to keep that in mind and be alert. And then there's also multiple law enforcement agencies that may uncover a labor trafficking case. So for example, here in California, the Sheriff's Department came across this case of the restaurant workers. We've also had the Police Department uncover the fruit vendor case because they were concerned about these fruit vendors in California, in San Francisco, that were selling fruit without a permit, and so they started asking questions. And the other piece to keep in mind that's really important when we think about domestic violence or sexual assault intersection cases, we have had many cases here in California of intersection domestic violence and human trafficking, where the police will go out to a domestic violence call, and fortunately a lot of the police are trained in terms of human trafficking, so when they start talking to the potential domestic violence victim, then they're trained to ask those additional questions, and through that screening process, the law enforcement officer has been able to identify, wait, something else is going on here. This is domestic violence, but this is also something else, and then that triggers the response in terms of the human trafficking advocate that can provide support. We've seen those similar types of intersection cases being identified through law enforcement where there's sexual assault and human trafficking, where the police officer is responding to a sexual assault call, and then during his investigation, his or her investigation, because again they're more in tune as to the dynamics and elements of human trafficking, they're able to ascertain, wait, this is sexual assault, but there's an additional layer. This could potentially be human trafficking as well. So it's so important for our law enforcement agencies, particularly the first responders, to be trained on this issue. We have had cases where the Department of Homeland Security, particularly the Homeland Security's investigation, has come across cases of human trafficking. The FBI has identified cases of human trafficking. The public defender has actually referred a couple of cases to us where there's individuals that are being charged with perhaps prostitution charges, but once they start talking more to the individual, they realize, wait a minute, there's some coercion here, there's some fraud here, this might be a human trafficking case. The Department of Labor actually identified a restaurant labor trafficking case that we worked on several years ago, where a concerned Good Samaritan was going to this restaurant. He'd go in the morning and he'd see the same workers. He went later that night, 12 hours later, the same workers. So this Good Samaritan became concerned and filed a report with the Department of Labor, and the Department of Labor was able to identify that, in fact, there was some labor trafficking happening there. We've also seen cases where individuals go to the EEOC to file a complaint for wage theft or sexual harassment in the workplace, and then it's identified that there's an intersection of wage theft and human trafficking or sexual harassment and human trafficking. I don't know, Maria Jose, if you want to add any of the other law enforcement organizations that might potentially uncover human trafficking in your experience.
I think you mentioned almost all. I think what we experience now most is the outcome of so many trainings and positive outcome for first responders. So more and more we see referrals from a regular state trooper or someone that is on road patrol, and they encounter a person either escaping or assistance, and they're able to respond in a positive way. They don't dismiss thinking, well, this couldn't be happening here in the United States like it used to be when they tell them what happened to them. And so now more and more we have police departments and sheriff's departments calling us and say we have someone in our office that we think is a victim of trafficking. And we are extremely pleased about that because for a long time, the calls were coming from the assistant U.S. attorney or the state attorney or the district attorney's office, and you know, more of the agencies that were receiving more training at the time.
Yeah, thank you. And then we also talk about not just law enforcement agencies, but there are so many other avenues through which a human trafficking survivor, a labor trafficking survivor could be identified. I mentioned earlier that the domestic violence and sexual assault service providers provided the impetus for creating the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. And a big piece of that is that we saw a lot of the survivors that were coming through our doors that in retrospect were actually human trafficking survivors as well. And particularly in Aisha's case, Aisha came to us about 2003, 2004, and at that time we were at the kind of infancy stages of developing our coalition, of developing the trainings. But it's so important for all domestic violence and sexual assault advocates to be trained on human trafficking. We've had multiple human trafficking survivors that have come in through our shelter, and the advocates at the shelter are able to conduct, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, what that screening looks like. They conduct a very brief screening and identify that the person could potentially be a human trafficking survivor as well. We have a family justice center that operates out of our office, and we've had many women that come in as domestic violence survivors seeking support from law enforcement, from an advocate, from an immigration attorney, and through some additional screening, it's identified that that individual, in addition to domestic violence or sexual assault, is also a labor trafficking survivor. We've had many community organizations identify human trafficking survivor, homeless service providers, Good Samaritans. We've had cases of Good Samaritans. For example, there's a woman that's a Jehovah's Witness and would go door-to-door preaching on a regular basis. And she routinely came across a woman that initially was very hesitant to engage in a conversation. And over the course of time and developing trust and rapport with that individual, the woman said to her, shared some of her situation where she was basically being held there, coerced to stay there against her will, was not being paid for the work that she did, etc. And this Good Samaritan, this Jehovah's Witness, didn't know who to call, but she called the domestic violence service provider and said, I don't think that this is right. And the service provider, fortunately, had been trained on human trafficking and was able to reach out to law enforcement and facilitated the identification and removal and support of that removal from the situation for that potential victim and connection to supportive services. The ice cream vendor case that I mentioned, that tip came in through a Good Samaritan that he called the National Human Trafficking Hotline and said, this doesn't seem right. There's the house across the street from my house. Every day early in the morning, there's a van that comes here and picks up all these guys. They're gone all day, and then they don't come back until 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night. The individuals seem scared. They never make eye contact with me when I'm out there. They seem scared of the individuals that are transporting them. It doesn't seem right. There's too many people living in that house. And thanks to that tip, law enforcement went out and conducted an investigation and were able to connect with several of those individuals and provide support. We've had several cases where if an individual is trafficked, they will then go back. If they see that they receive support, they will then go back and let other people know. For example, with we've had the case with the fruit vendors. Two individuals originally reached out to law enforcement for support. we're connected to an advocate, we're connected to an immigration attorney, and they were able then to vouch for us and to go back to the other potential victims and say, you know what, nothing happened. I asked for support. I wasn't deported. I wasn't penalized. I received support, and now I'm going to be able to apply for some legal remedies and immigration relief. The same thing with the cosmetologist, that one individual had the courage to go and speak to law enforcement and complain about not being paid, and law enforcement determined there's a human trafficking case, and that individual, because she connected with the service providers, with the legal providers, again, was able to vouch for us and go back and say, you can trust these agencies. They're here to support you. We have many cases in that situation, and I think that particularly what's really in the agricultural sector, as I mentioned earlier, that sometimes it can be very difficult with specific cultures or specific communities to develop trust. So if you have an individual from that community that can vouch for you and say, I work with this agency, they supported me, you can trust them, that is huge. And with the child welfare agencies here in California, particularly this organization, the Department of Family and Children Services is now responsible for ensuring that any commercially sexually exploited child receives support, and they also are able to work with the unaccompanied minors that might potentially be labor trafficking victims. So we're always called in when that happens. We've had cases of clinics and hospitals where individuals go in to report a sexual assault or domestic violence, and then we work very closely with our clinics and hospitals to train them on the potential for labor trafficking and what those dynamics look like. So we've had cases of hospitals call us and say, we have a woman in the emergency room. She came in as domestic violence. There's something else going on. I think it's human trafficking, and we're able to connect. We've also had cases through mental health service providers where they're connected to us for labor trafficking, and I mentioned homeless and youth groups. So it's really important that we are developing those relationships across the board and providing community outreach and training across the board, because we just never know how a human trafficking survivor will be identified. Maria, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, while you're talking, Perla, I've been looking a little bit at the questions, and people are asking a United States citizen being victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, and that intersecting with labor trafficking. And by listening to your examples, many of those are also from individuals that are United States citizens, not only foreigners or non-citizens. So if you have any examples, I'll let you go ahead. I'll give you one example of a woman that we work, United States citizen, who was, she had a cognitive disability. Her boyfriend took advantage of that and was collecting her Social Security checks, was sending her to sell flowers in the streets, hours and hours in the sun. Imagine Florida, 90 degrees, and she was in a corner selling flowers. He would take all the money. So that was one of the cases that we referred to the local shelter. She was a domestic violence victim. She was a victim of sexual assault, and she was also a victim of trafficking. And we didn't have to provide assistance for her because she was already a United States citizen, and she was born in the United States, but she needed all the other services. So that's just one example. If you want to highlight any of your cases, go ahead.
Sure. We definitely have had cases of labor trafficking or sex trafficking that are U.S. citizens. In fact, about 99% of the commercially sexually exploited youth that we work with are domestic victims, and they are U.S. citizens. The majority of the sex trafficking victims that we work with, the transitional age youth, so up to age 25, are domestic sex trafficking victims. And we've had multiple cases where a domestic violence survivor has accessed services and then shared with us, my partner has forced me into sex work and to basically profit off of my sex work. So there's a case of domestic violence and sex trafficking. So even though those individuals, even though immigration may not be an issue, there are other services and benefits that individual would be able to connect to. So yes, I'd say that about 70% of the human trafficking survivors that we work with are domestic victims. And when we think about what are some of the questions that we can ask to tease out of the individual, in addition to being a domestic violence or sexual assault survivor, might also be a labor trafficking survivor, we've developed a list and we've categorized it in different areas like safety concerns, living conditions, social networks, origins. And I just want to put out there that this is definitely not an exhaustive list. The purpose is to identify potential human trafficking survivors and then refer them to an attorney for a full screening. We also want to prepare, after asking a couple of these questions, the advocate determines there might be human trafficking here. We refer that individual to an attorney, make sure that we provide transportation and accompaniment, and we do want to prepare that individual and say, the attorney's going to ask you a lot of questions that might feel personal. They try to be very trauma-informed, but some of these questions might be difficult for you. So that's why it's so important for an advocate to transport the survivor, be able to provide peer counseling during that transportation, and then after the interview, be able to debrief with that individual and provide support. The other piece that's really important is that when we provide any type of screening, we don't keep notes. We don't say answered yes to this, no to this. If we think that individual might potentially be a human trafficking survivor, we'll make a brief note in their file, refer to an attorney. So some of the questions that we ask around safety issues, if they've been harmed in any way, if anyone's threatened to harm them, if they leave, and if anyone is forcing them to do anything that they don't want to do. And that's pretty broad. And so we want to keep it broad. We don't want to ask specific questions that might make that individual uncomfortable. And that individual is going to share with us as little or as much as they feel comfortable with sharing. The living conditions are really important. Where do you sleep and eat? Because, for example, with the case of in Aisha's case, she was sleeping in a little cot in one of the spare bedrooms. Most of the labor trafficking survivors that we've worked with, particularly in the larger scale cases, they're sleeping on the floor, they're sleeping on a cot. They're not basically sleeping with and interacting with the rest of the family as if they were part of that family. Have they been deprived of food, water, sleep, or medical care? A lot of times that's an issue. And are there locks or doors on your windows so you cannot get out? Again, a lot of times that's the reason that we pose that question. The majority of the times, labor trafficking survivors, particularly when it's an intersection with domestic violence, they are not being physically confined, but there's the coercion. So a lot of times this question prompts, well, no, there were no locks or no doors, but where am I going to go? No, there's no locks on the doors, but this individual knows where I live and where my family lives. And he made comments like, if you leave, that accidents can happen, and I know where your family lives. So that question is really to prompt more of a conversation, because if we pose it in a different way, like that you feel like you couldn't leave, then we might make that person feel defensive. The other types of questions that we ask are around social networks, this is really important. Can you come and go as you please? Can you have friends over? Can you contact your family and friends when you want to? Because sometimes they, as I mentioned with Aisha, she was able to call her family back at home once a week, but Robert and his family were in the same room watching her and feeding her what she needed to say. So can you contact them freely? And again, can you bring friends or significant others to your house if you wanted to? That piece is really important. And then origins, we would only ask if that individual is foreign-born. Did you come to the U.S. For a specific purpose? We've seen an increase in the number of young women that are being brought in from Mexico and what we would call, for lack of a better term, Romeo pimps. And these are exploiters that they'll basically have these women fall in love with them, bring them to the U.S. saying you're going to be my wife or my partner or my living girlfriend. And once they get here, they force those young women into sex work. And so that's why we ask that question kind of broadly. Did you come here for a specific purpose? And it's like, well, yes, I came here because I was going to marry my boyfriend. And then, that's not what happened. When you got here, did you have to do work, or was the situation different from what you expected? And then also, who made your travel arrangements? Do they control your passport and your documents?
Did I change it for you? I'm sorry.
I think so.
So sorry.
Uh-oh, what happened here? So Maria Jose, do you want to talk a little bit about this slide?
Yeah, very briefly, this is just in a way of summarizing what we've been discussing, the intersection cases. Just remember to identify the labor component. There are horrific things that are happening to people that are kidnapped, perhaps extorted, but then never made to work. So those cases may be a case of kidnapping or a case of extortion, or it may be a purely case of domestic violence, but there's not, you don't find that labor aspect of the trafficking endeavor. So think about that. Think of someone that is has to pay a debt, someone that is working towards people that are told you're going to be working for a certain amount of years and then you're going to send home, or simply people that are working right now for no specific time and no contract and no debt, but they are forced to work against their will. And something bad will happen if they try to leave. So that's very important. Look for the fraud, for coercion, and then not only think about the cases like Aisha, which is within the intimate relationship, but what are the components? Someone working in a factory, but also experiencing domestic violence at home. The two, the trafficker and the domestic violence perpetrator are not connected, but that individual is getting to your center, and you're going to be able to, through the questions that Perla was covering, you're going to be able to discover that there are other forms of victimization that she or he is experiencing. Why do we need to talk about labor trafficking? Why do we want to know? Why are we opening this Pandora box? And it's because there are many different services available and benefits available for victims of human trafficking that could go unused. And I will talk about since I'm the one starting this slide, but then I let Perla talk about benefits, but I want to just talk about briefly about access to immigration relief. So someone that is in this country undocumented, or that their immigration status is connected to the victimization, the employer holds power over their visa, they could have access to either a U visa or a T visa, or to continue presence, or many other forms of immigration relief that are available, asylum, VAWA petition. If you're already working with immigrant survivors, you may have already heard all of these type of visas. We don't have the time to go into each one of them, and there's other trainings for that, but knowing that there is the need to call an immigration attorney that is versed both in the victimization part and also the immigration part connected to protections for violations of human rights. So in general, all the array of visas available. And that is tied also to access to civil restitution. In many cases, the individual does not want to be connected with a criminal case. They don't want to prosecute the employers if they are nannies or their family members. In the case of Aisha, perhaps she says, well, Robert is a friend of the family. My parents will be not happy about me calling the police, but maybe I would like to get my wages back. So then referring the individual to an attorney that is versed on wage theft and compensation for damages, torts, where the person can sue the employer and get their wages, past wages, and also the damages that they experience. And Perla, you can go on with the next, with
sure.
the other.
The other piece that's particularly helpful for foreign-born human trafficking survivors is that if they are certified as human trafficking survivors, they can access federal benefits that are similar to benefits available to refugees. So that would include 8 months of emergency Medi-Cal, cash aid assistance, and food assistance as well. For many of the survivors that we work with, they have not seen a doctor or medical provider in years. So that piece is huge. And then in addition to the federal benefits, there are also, most states have adopted similar benefits at the state level. So the individual originally would apply for the state benefits with the support of an attorney and an advocate, and for 8 months would receive from the state cash aid, food assistance, and Medi-Cal, and then an additional 8 months of the same benefits at the federal level. So it's really important that they're able to access these supportive services. And I want to talk a little bit about the unique circumstances that may affect labor trafficking survivors. Maria, if you could start us off with the immigration status, talk a little bit about that.
Very briefly, for the sake of time, I think this is a subject that we could be talking about on 8-hour training. But again, being cognizant that if you have an immigrant, a non-citizen, in your center and seeking assistance because of domestic violence or sexual violence, that talking about how they are here and what are the conditions of their employment is important, because they may be here on visas, as I mentioned before, that are connected to the employer. The employer keeps the passport, tells them that if they leave, they will be deported. And there are people that these individuals are legal in the United States. They're able to work legally. They can go back and forth from their countries, but that power, and this is similar to domestic violence, the power and control exerted by an abuser is also the power and control that these visas give the employer, and that employer could turn into a trafficker. So keep that in mind and ask them, once that you develop the trust, once the person feels comfortable, how are you here, what are the conditions on your employment, and then immediately if you see that is the case, that these visas are on their passports, that they need to talk to an immigration attorney that can help them with that.
Okay, and then the other piece that's also really important to keep in mind, and I would say in about 70% of the labor trafficking cases that we have supported, and if it's also an intersection domestic violence case, I'd say closer to 95%, the victim is dependent on the abuser for housing. So that piece is really important to keep in mind, because that's going to be a huge consideration for that victim in deciding to leave, and also in terms of the future support that they will access. When we're talking specifically about large labor trafficking cases, for example, restaurant cases, fruit vendor cases, situations where there might be potentially multiple victims, it's really important to interview each one of those workers separately, because a lot of times we don't know what the dynamics are in that particular situation. It might be that perhaps out of 10 employees, 8 are being trafficked, and 2 are friends or family members of the trafficker that are helping to keep those employees in line, quote unquote. So that's what's so important, and what we have found over the years in these types of cases, it's important to be able to interview each one of those workers separately to ascertain what their unique situation is, and if there's any dynamics that are happening in the background. The other piece in terms of unique needs for human trafficking survivors, individualized case assessment is really important. And I think that a lot of this is not with domestic violence or sexual assault. We always approach this work in a way that's very individualized to each potential survivor that we work with. In terms of multi-survivor cases, there's huge housing concerns that come up. Particularly, we've had a couple of cases of labor trafficking involving multiple men. In terms of providing shelter, often we will bring human trafficking female survivors into our shelter and provide support, but it becomes a little bit challenging if they're families, if they're large groups of men or women. And the other thing that I'll talk a little bit more about is that with human trafficking survivors, what we're finding, particularly for foreign-born survivors, that both the breadth and the depth of services that we need to provide are many times much larger than what we've been accustomed to in domestic violence or sexual assault cases. There's under-recognized forms of trauma, a lot of PTSD, depression, anxiety. We've had several human trafficking survivors that express suicidal ideation. I have had a couple of, because they become when they're removed from that situation, there's a lot of guilt also that comes into play because, again, as I mentioned, it's so important to think about the fact that many times the victims know they're exploiters, and particularly for victims that are brought here from another country, for example, with the restaurant, with the fruit vendor case, the individuals that decided to stay here and participate in the criminal process, they had felt a lot of guilt about, quote unquote, turning against their friends that brought them here from Mexico, for good or for bad. So that piece is really important to keep in mind. I see that somebody's moving along my slides here, so I'll go through these quickly. Advocates, as with domestic violence and sexual assault, human trafficking advocates act as a hub to ensure that all of the different needs of human trafficking survivors are met. What we developed in working with domestic violence survivors and sexual assault survivors, we were really used to working with a high volume of cases that with survivors that had intense needs, but only for perhaps a couple of months. And what we found with human trafficking cases is that, again, the breadth and depth of support that individuals need is much more intensive. So we developed a case management model that looks at the different phases of case management where a survivor will need support. The emergency crisis phase is basically from identification or from the first meeting with the victim up to 30 days. Transitional or stabilization phase would be from 30 days up to 8 months. And the long-term support phase is from 8 months to 2 years. And we're finding that the majority of the labor trafficking survivors that we work with, we are providing support for a minimum of, an average rather, of 2 years. The process is not always linear. Sometimes the clients, when they're connected to an advocate, they're in a stable situation, but there could be some type of triggering event. A crisis comes up, maybe they have to testify in court, so we have to meet survivors where they are. So for example, here in Aisha's story, that's the case management, the first phase, this individual, during that first contact up to 30 days, Aisha would be connected to an advocate. We ensure that her basic needs are met for shelter, food. Communication is such a huge piece, especially for foreign-born survivors, making sure that that survivor has the means to communicate safely back home. Safety planning, and then ensuring that that food and other resources, that Aisha had access to that, as well as ensuring connection to medical and mental health support services. That piece is very important. During the transitional phase, we are then starting to stabilize, working with Aisha towards realization. So connecting her to an immigration attorney, employment law attorney if that's appropriate, providing transportation and advocacy so that Aisha can connect to the social service benefits that I mentioned. And then if that individual needs support getting into a transitional housing program, providing that support, continuing to ensure that her food and other basic needs are met, and also connecting Aisha to community support. So whether that be a faith-based group that she wants support from, ensuring that her network of support is expanding. That piece is really important. And then during the long-term or stability and sustainability phase, with Aisha particularly, she was able to receive her work permit, and if the case, so if this happened to be a labor trafficking case where there was wage restitution that can happen, that would happen during this phase, and Aisha would also begin her job search. We've helped Aisha get into permanent housing, and then if there's other types of vocational training or ESL classes that she is interested in, basically how we support survivors really mirrored after the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, ensuring that their basic needs are met before they could move on to that self-sustainability phase. And again, this is just a model that we developed. I'm happy to share any information. Email Monica if you're interested. And each organization can develop a case management model that best fits your existing structure and services. So in terms of taking action and what each organization can do, again, as I just mentioned, it's really important to review and adapt intake processes to help identify potential victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, where there's intersection with labor trafficking. We're in the process of developing a screening tool that I am going to be sharing with Monica, and if you're interested in that screening tool, please reach out to her. Develop practices that address the domestic violence sexual assault survivor needs during those 3 phases that I mentioned, or develop a model that, again, best fits for the populations that you're working with and the existing structures of your organization. And Maria Jose, do you want to go through the last 2 bullets?
Yes, we're getting to the end. So I would like to challenge you to, when you are preparing for this type of cases and you are your organizations or the individuals working within your organizations are committing to provide services to survivors of labor trafficking, is that you think that also these phases that you're preparing for the immediate assistance for crisis and then the responses to intermediate and the long term, that this could be this could come to you in many years back. And for us that have been working with cases that have lasted more than 10 years, they have lasted more than 10 years, we see now the children coming to the United States and reunifying. And those instances of new crisis moments call for more assistance from the community. And what we find is that the traditional services are not available for survivors of trafficking anymore after so many years that the trafficking occur. So for us, it's always, as legal service providers, always trying to find and developing these relationships in the community with other service providers to always be ready, parenting classes, how to reunify these families, things that happen after the fact, after now that the prosecution is over. So all those relationships are going to be extremely beneficial for the survivor and for the community in general. So the challenge is that to advocate internally with your agency, to advocate within your community, to advocate with law enforcement and other governmental organizations, and to look into the legislation that is present in your state or your community that could perhaps change or improve by mirroring the federal law. And we gave you a list of links, and I wanted to say a few things about them. Of course, the Office for Victims of Crime, you should go there and look, opportunities for grants, opportunities for training. That is also connected to the OVC TTAC organization. I am apologizing for the use of acronyms, and I did gave you the explanation of what is the EOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and I see that Monica is also giving you the link to a list of terminology and acronyms. The Freedom Network USA is a national organization that was created in 2001. We are all service providers, the members of the organization, so you get the information and experience of organizations that have been working in this field for many, many, many years, over 20 years in some of the cases. You, right now, if you go on the website, you can read the latest reports, and you can get information there for your agencies. The Polaris Project, which responds to the national hotline and also has other information for you, very beneficial. And there's also the fact sheet from HHS on labor trafficking, well, trafficking in general, and services available.
Great.
Elena?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Maria Jose and Perla. That was an incredible amount of information. And thank you so much for your time and work in putting it together. One other resource I want to mention is here at Futures, under a different program, our health team will be hosting webinars in the next coming months for healthcare professionals on human trafficking. So stay tuned into our website for more information on those webinars when they become available at a later date. And I think we're just about at time. For those who are able to stay a couple of extra minutes, one question that did come up was about confidentiality, and when working with collaborations, folks from different disciplines, do you both take into consideration differing confidentiality standards And if you want to speak to that just very briefly, it could be a whole other webinar topic, I know, but I wanted at least to get out there as well that's another issue that's come up.
This is Maria Jose, and Perla alluded to this, and it's very important. And Perla described how the advocates don't keep notes in their files, and I think this is very important for all of you that you're starting to work in this field. And it's true if you're already working in domestic violence field or sexual violence field. But I think what not the confusion, but what it becomes more convoluted and more difficult is that you're developing the relationships across governmental and non-governmental organizations, and you want to have this relationship of trust with them, but also you are telling them, I have a barrier, and my client, I owe a duty of confidentiality as an advocate, as an attorney, and they're all different levels. So you need to look at what are your own state laws, what are your confidentiality and privilege laws, also compare them with the federal. Taking a webinar only on confidentiality is critical, or a training on confidentiality. I know that different organizations are providing these trainings, so please seek that assistance in that sense. And Perla, if you would like to add something to that, go ahead.
I think that you basically, that's the same thing that I was going to say, that most of the providers that were and the different sectors that we're used to working with understand that as domestic violence or sexual assault advocates, we do have a confidentiality privilege with our clients. And so it hasn't been too challenging to explain when working with human trafficking survivors. There's also a confidentiality privilege. So look up, as Maria Jose said, in California, we have a caseworker privilege for human trafficking advocates. Do some research in terms of what the laws are in your state. And I think that, again, because we've already exerted with domestic violence or sexual assault, we've already been able to establish that the communication with our client is confidential. If I have a release from the client, then I can share certain information with you. It hasn't been too challenging to also extend that confidentiality for human trafficking survivors as well. I think it's been well received with the different groups that we work with.
And share that information with your law enforcement partners, because sometimes you assume that they are stepping over the boundaries, but it's because they don't know the details. So invite them to the trainings, and so that you can be on the same page.
That's wonderful. Thank you both. I think we could do a whole nother webinar just on that topic in particular.
Yeah, definitely.
But thank you to all of our listeners out there that are still on. Another reminder, we're hosting another webinar next week on collaborating with faith-based organizations and community-based organizations to address human trafficking. And please remember to fill out our evaluation, which should pop up on your screen when you exit the meeting. You can also access it by clicking on the link below. Your feedback is really important to us, and I hope that everyone has a great day and has found the webinar helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.